listeners. I'm your host, Camilla Pintos Lopez, and this is Eternal Stories. This podcast series is brought to you by Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries, New South Wales. For more information about the cemeteries and the work they do, feel free to visit their website at www.smcnsw.org.au. We'd like to begin this episode by acknowledging the Bidjigal people of La Perouse from the Eora Nation, traditional custodians of the land, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. In the 1930s, a strange and mysterious thing started happening in Sydney. In and around the city, people were noticing yellow chalk etchings of the word eternity crop up in various locations, on footpaths and doorsteps, even railway station entrances. There was no signature, no indication of who was responsible, just the same one-word tag. Sydney-siders would come to recognise this pattern not just for a month, not just for a year, but in fact for 35 years. Every morning, somewhere in the city, eternity would make an appearance in people's walk to work or on their way to buy the morning paper. The most seemingly mundane of activities would sometimes include the glimpse of the eventually famous phrase. At first, people didn't understand why the eternity marking was suddenly a part of their daily routine, or what it even meant exactly. More importantly, people were interested to know who was responsible. The man who writes eternity quickly became a local legend, an unknown face with a piece of yellow chalk and a message to share. Funnily enough, the person we would all later come to know as Mr. Eternity was someone who was illiterate and could in fact barely write his own name. His identity over the decades of his work would eventually be revealed as Mr. Arthur Stace, an Australian soldier, a Christian convert, and still to this day, a remarkable part of Sydney history. This is his story. Arthur Malcolm Stace was born on the 9th of February 1885 in Redfern, Sydney. He was the fifth child of William Wood Stace and Laura Stace, née Lewis. Both William and Laura were reportedly alcoholics, and Arthur, with his other siblings, grew up in poverty as a result. So much so that Arthur's early years involved the petty theft of things like bread and milk, and rummaging through bins for food scraps in order to survive. It comes as no surprise that Arthur's upbringing didn't have a heavy focus on education. By the age of 12, he had ceased formal schooling and begun work in a coal mine when he officially became a ward of the state. During his early teen years, he himself followed his parents' example and became an alcoholic, eventually being sent to prison at the turn of the century when he was just 15 years old. Once his stint in jail was up, Arthur continued in his criminal habits at first in order to earn money. He became a lookout for the gambling game of two-up, a job with the nickname Cockatoo, and by his early 20s, he took up work as a scout for his sister's brothels. Eventually, his working life would transition into more legal forms of work. By the age of 30, he was working as a labourer in the city, and just 2 years later, he enlisted in the army in March of 1916. During World War I, Arthur was a soldier in the Australian Imperial Force, 19th Battalion, 5th Brigade, service number 5934. However, numerous health issues with his lungs, more specifically pleurisy and bronchitis, led to his eventual discharge from the army on medical grounds on the 2nd of April 1919. With his discharge from the army official at a time when the Great Depression had officially struck and his sense of purpose removed, Arthur Stace began to fall back on old habits. His drinking increased again, and coupled with his ailing mental health from the war, the next few years would see Arthur hopelessly searching for solutions and constantly coming up short. At one point, he checked himself into Broughton Hall, a psychiatric hospital in Roselle, with a heavy focus on war veterans who were suffering from mental health issues, but not strictly insane. His time at Broughton Hall was largely unhelpful. It did nothing to help him with his addiction, nor was the idea of being committed into the mental asylum Callum Park a deterrent for Arthur's antisocial ways, even though, in a strange twist of fate, his father had also been committed and passed away whilst inside the asylum. Out of Broughton Hall, Arthur began to run into issues with the law once again. A charge of drunken disorderly conduct landed him a night in the holding cell, and the next day, when he appeared at Central Police Court, the magistrate's threat of sending him to Long Bay before letting him off didn't appear to have helped. In fact, Arthur, so desperate at one point, walked himself into the police station on Regent Street in Broadway and asked to be jailed in order to give him the opportunity to start his life again sober. The officer on duty refused on the grounds that he smelled of methylated spirits and told him to leave, so Arthur walked back out into the cold of Sydney's winter during a time when he was one of many affected and displaced by the economic strife of the Great Depression. However, Arthur's outlook was about to change, and from a source he'd least expect. On the 6th of August, 1930, Arthur Stace and a few of his fellow homeless friends decided to attend one of R.B.S. Hammond's weekly men's meetings at St. Barnabas's Church on Broadway. The motivation for doing so was admittedly nowhere near religious, but in fact due to the knowledge that hot tea and cake was provided to attendees after the meeting. Arthur would later go on to recount this life-changing decision many times over the decades following, saying he went into the meeting for a rock cake and came out with the Rock of Ages. Simply put, that evening of the 6th of August 1930 provided Arthur with the epiphany he'd perhaps been waiting for his whole life, and at the age of 45, he had clarity at last. You see, it was during this evening meeting that Arthur noticed something about 6 particular attendees sitting in the front row. Well-dressed and clean, he asked his friend what about them made them different. His friend's response? They're Christians. It was then that Arthur decided that if that were the case, he would give the religion a go, even before Reverend Hammond started speaking. At one point, it is said that Hammond made a plea to his audience that resonated with Arthur. If any of you men are sick of the way you are living, there is one who loves you, who will set you free, and his name is Jesus. It's no surprise why those words piqued an interest within, having connected to the very thing Arthur had been trying to express countless times before. After he drank his tea and ate his rock cake, Arthur left the meeting and walked across to Victoria Park, where under a large fig tree he felt compelled to say a simple prayer. He said from that night forward he never drank again, a changed man with a fresh start. Days later, he returned to St. Barnabas's to discuss faith with Reverend Hammond and learned what he called the 2 secrets of success in Christian life: prayer and obedience. After a short while, Arthur stopped gambling and smoking and even tried his level best to refrain from swearing. He began taking pride in his appearance at the weekly meetings, eventually showing up always wearing a suit and tie, shiny shoes, and his iconic Homburg hat. He got himself a job as a janitor at the Burton Street Baptist Tabernacle in Darlinghurst and joined the congregation, not realizing at the time that this would lead him to make his mark. With a new lease on life, Arthur was dedicated to his faith. But it wasn't until he heard a sermon from evangelist John Ridley that he would become dedicated to spreading his message. Amongst a congregation in November of 1932 in Burton Street Baptist Tabernacle, John Ridley said he wished he could shout eternity through the streets of Sydney. You've got to meet it. Where will you spend eternity? It was in this moment that Arthur said he felt a powerful call from the Lord to write eternity, and as luck would have it, Arthur just so happened to have a piece of chalk in his pocket. Right then and there, he wrote the first eternity tag, something quite remarkable for an illiterate man, but with this particular word, felt like second nature. He would continue to do so at least 50 times a day for the rest of his life. For a while, he wrote "Obey God" as an alternative, but quickly decided it wasn't as good, saying the one-word tag eternity made people think. Around the streets of Sydney, in the inner city suburbs, and all the way out to Parramatta, Stace would use waterproof yellow chalk, and in copperplate font, the word eternity would magically appear for Sydney-siders to see. His favourite location to write? King's Cross, due to the pavements in the area being the perfect canvas for the chalk. On an inspiring day, Arthur Stace's habit would cost him 6 bob in chalk, but with great payoff. Most of his messaging could last between 3 to 6 months. On one occasion, he was told a particular etching in Surrey Hills lasted a full year. Arthur continued to spread his message in anonymity, calling himself a missioner because he felt as if he was doing the Lord's work in his own way. And even with his busy schedule, he still managed to find love. On the 22nd of January 1942, he married Ellen Esther Dawson, affectionately referred to as Pearl, at St Barnabas's Anglican Church, the same venue that saved him. They lived together in Bulwarra Road, Pyrmont, for decades to come. With so many long-lasting tags, it's a little surprising no one figured out sooner who the man who writes eternity was. But curiosity hit its peak with Sydney journalists over the years, and in 1956, his identity would finally be revealed. You see, Arthur was not a man who liked attention. He chose to write the word in the pre-dawn hours to avoid his identity becoming known. Newspaper articles here and there would write stories about the elusive Mr. Eternity that were largely speculative, and a few false confessions over the years created enough red herrings. But it was Arthur's boss, Lyle Thompson, that finally caught his janitor chalk-handed, decades after the compulsion began. Lyle wrote a short piece on his discovery and sent it to the Sunday Telegraph, with the secret finally revealed in print on the 21st of June, 1956. Even with his identity no longer a secret, Stace didn't seem deterred to continue with his higher purpose. He continued his scribing and even on occasion did interviews. However, it is known that only 4 photographs of Mr. Eternity were ever taken. Probably the most famous photograph of Arthur shows him in his suit and hat, bent over a fresh tag, chalk in fist. But for the most part, Arthur continued as if nothing had changed. Just 5 years later, Pearl would pass away in 1961, and in 1965, Arthur moved out of their marital residence and into the Hammondville homes in Pyrmont. On the 30th of July 1967, Arthur passed away there and donated his body to the University of Sydney Medical School, whilst his life savings was given to Baptist missions. Today, only 2 original inscriptions of Arthur's work still exist, with one held at the National Museum of Australia in Canberra. The other is inside the bell in the Sydney General Post Office clock tower. During the Second World War, the clock tower was dismantled, and when it was rebuilt in the 1960s, workers who brought the bell out of storage noticed the famous eternity in yellow chalk. How Arthur managed to write on the bell remains a mystery to this day, and something I'm sure Arthur would be incredibly proud of. It's said that over the decades, Arthur Stace would have written his famous catchphrase over 500,000 times. Ironically, at the time of his death, chalking was considered illegal in the state of New South Wales. However, Section 4, Subsection 5 of the New South Wales Graffiti Control Act now protects the right to mark public footpaths and pavements, and has been called Arthur's Law. But even more remarkable is the lasting impact his 8-letter inscription would have on the history of Sydney, even after he was laid to rest in Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park, with eternity written on his gravestone. Many memorials and events have occurred over the years as a way of paying homage to the famous Mr. Eternity and keeping his message alive. In 1977, a brass plaque was unveiled in a paving stone near the Sydney Square waterfall, reading "Eternity" in Arthur's favourite copperplate font. Artist George Gittos incorporated Arthur Stace's face in his work Ancient Prayer, which would win the Blake Prize for Religious Art in 1992. A film by Lawrence Johnston entitled Eternity would be released in 1994 about the famous scribe, and a chamber opera by Jonathan Mills and Dorothy Porter named The Eternity Man would be performed at the Sydney Festival in 2005. A cafe in Central Railway Station was named Eternity Cafe in his honour, and the word eternity can be seen above the entrance. Roy Williams with Elizabeth Myers had published a biography of Arthur Stace called Mr. Eternity, with rave reviews, and is also a source used in this podcast episode. The former Burton Street Tabernacle in Darlinghurst, where Arthur first heard his famous phrase, was converted into a playhouse in 2011, and fittingly named the Eternity Playhouse, with eternity found in various locations throughout the venue. But perhaps most iconic and fitting for the legend, and something Arthur himself could never have expected, was the decision made by the City of Sydney itself. The Sydney New Year's Eve celebration of 1999, famous around the world for its firework displays, had the Sydney Harbour Bridge emblazoned with the word eternity as the clock struck midnight into the year 2000 to ring in the new millennium, and an eventful year ahead for the city, with its 2000 Olympic Games also featuring eternity during the opening ceremony of the 27th Olympiad. We hope you've enjoyed this episode on the eternal legend Arthur Stace. On the next episode, we'll be looking at another Australian icon, First Nations war hero Jack Alec Bond, with a recent memorial having just taken place at Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park on the 31st of May to commemorate his achievements. For more information on this episode and the podcast, feel free to head to our Facebook pages under Warranora Memorial Park and Eastern Suburbs Memorial Park, or on LinkedIn at Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries, New South Wales. Our website is www.smcnsw.org.au. And of course, thank you for listening.